Normandy, August 1944. The hedgerows were burning. Smoke and cordite hung over the narrow lanes, thick as fog. A column of Shermans crawled forward, their engines straining, tracks chewing the mud like teeth. In the lead tank, Staff Sergeant Thomas Keane crouched behind the breech of his 75mm gun, sweat running down his back despite the chill of dawn. His loader, Private Collins, was breathing hard, counting under his breath, a rhythm drilled into muscle memory. "Up," said Collins. "On," Keane answered. "Fire." The first shell left the barrel with a dull, concussive roar. The recoil threw the turret back, the smell of burnt propellant flooding the steel coffin. Through the periscope, Keane saw the hit. A Panther's turret ring shattered, but another German tank was turning toward them from the orchard. "Load!" he shouted. Collins swung around for another shell, but the turret was jammed half a degree off-center. The breech hadn't locked fully open. A half-second delay. Nothing in a factory, eternity in combat. The Panther's gun flared white. The ground beside them exploded. Dirt and metal rained across the hull. Keane's mind froze and then accelerated. He reached down and pulled the breech lever back. But instead of waiting for the recoil spring to settle, he caught it mid-return, half-cocked it, and jammed it forward again. A motion that shouldn't have worked. A motion no manual allowed. The shell seated. Collins' eyes went wide. "You can't—" "Shut it!" Keane snapped. He fired. 2 rounds, less than 5 seconds apart. The Panther's muzzle flash was still dying when Keane's second shot struck home. The explosion tore through the German tank's side armor, venting black smoke and flame. In the command tank behind them, Lieutenant Farley blinked. Did he just double fire? Through the headset came another voice, disbelieving. "He can't. Not possible." But the German line was already folding. The second Panther backed into a ditch, its crew bailing. The hedgerow that had been a trap became an escape route. Inside the turret, Keane exhaled hard, hand trembling over the hot breech. The metal hissed where oil met heat. He looked at Collins, who was still staring at him like he'd seen witchcraft. "What the hell did you just do?" the loader asked. Keane shrugged, half grinning. "Skipped a step." That night, as the platoon regrouped, word spread fast. Not about the kill, but the rhythm. The impossible rhythm. A Sherman had fired twice before a Panther could reload once. And from that moment on, the myth of slow American guns began to crack. Every army in World War II had its sacred limitations. Rules written not by soldiers, but by engineers, committees, and safety boards. For American tank crews, one of those rules was simple. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not, under any safe or reasonable condition, fire faster than 8 rounds per minute. Not because the gun itself couldn't handle it, but because the humans inside couldn't. Official manuals spelled it out like scripture. The process had 8 steps: align, open breech, eject casing, load, ram, close, aim, fire. Every motion timed, every cycle rehearsed. The rate of fire wasn't physics, it was choreography. And the Army had spent 3 years teaching men that you couldn't rush choreography without breaking it. Quartermasters, ordnance officers, even engineers from the Aberdeen Proving Ground, all agreed that speed meant sloppiness, and sloppiness killed. "The weapon is sound," one 1943 ordnance report read, "but the limit is the man." The manuals assumed that human rhythm was fixed, that you could only train for precision, not for tempo. They were wrong. The Sherman wasn't slow because its gun was outdated. It was slow because it was safe. The 75mm M3 cannon was built with generous recoil tolerances, a full 11 inches of travel to absorb shock. That recoil cycle, though necessary for stability, also locked the breech shut until every ounce of backward motion was spent. Regulations demanded crews wait until the recoil cylinder had completely settled before opening the breech. 2 seconds of dead time. That's where Keane found his moment. Every other Sherman gunner accepted those 2 seconds as law. Keane, a machinist before the war, saw them as waste. He'd spent his youth cutting sheet steel and resetting presses between strokes. To him, rhythm wasn't a law. It was leverage. But the myth persisted in every training field and depot, the one that said, "The faster you fire, the faster you die." Tankers repeated it like a prayer. The enemy, too, believed it. German reports routinely mocked the Sherman's inferior cyclic rate. They assumed the American tank couldn't outshoot them, only outnumber them. That assumption held through North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. The Panther's 75mm KWK-42 could reload in roughly 7 seconds under ideal conditions. The Tiger's 88mm, a bit slower at 9 to 10. The Sherman averaged 8.5, close enough to compete, but never to surprise. That's why, when Keane's tank fired twice in 5 seconds, nobody believed it. The math didn't fit. It wasn't supposed to be possible without a mechanical malfunction or double charge. But Keane hadn't broken the gun. He'd broken the sequence. He ignored the recoil cycle and preloaded the breech in mid-return, cutting out the mechanical delay that everyone else treated as sacred. It wasn't magic. It was timing. And once you start changing timing, everything else, doctrine, safety, hierarchy, begins to unravel. That was the real heresy. Not that a Sherman could fire faster, but that a man could prove the Army wrong using nothing more than instinct and a wrench. From that moment on, the question wasn't if you could double the rate of fire. It was how much you were willing to risk to do it. Because in war, every shortcut has a price. And Keane was about to pay it. Before anyone can understand what Keane changed, you have to understand how the Sherman's gun actually worked. Because for most tankers, firing wasn't just squeezing a trigger. It was a ballet of mechanics and muscle performed inside a metal drum smaller than a kitchen pantry. The Sherman's main gun, the 75mm M3, sat inside a compact turret that rotated manually or by hydraulic traverse. The gunner's eye aligned with a periscope sight. The commander called the target. The loader stood to the gun's right, shoulders brushing the shell racks. Everything in that turret was built for rhythm, not comfort. A well-trained crew could perform the sequence in their sleep. Step 1, target call. Commander shouts, "Tank 400 yards, left hedge." Step 2, gunner slews turret. Traverse handle whines. Step 3, loader grabs a shell, a 14-pound brass cylinder, and readies it against the breech. Step 4, gunner fires. The cannon jerks back, smoke and recoil filling the space. Step 5. Breech opens automatically, but only once the recoil piston completes its full rearward stroke. Step 6. Ejector arm flings the spent casing. Loader rams the next round. Step 7. Gunner locks the breech, re-aims, fires again. On paper, that's 7.5 to 9 seconds per shot, if everything goes right. In combat, it rarely did. Mud, sweat, and adrenaline turned seconds into eternities. Shells slipped from greasy hands. Spent casings jammed underfoot. Recoil buffers sometimes misaligned after rough terrain, adding more delay. Even the human rhythm was flawed. Too many small hesitations, each stacking into inefficiency. The gun itself could handle much more. Tests at Aberdeen showed the M3 cannon could cycle safely at 15 rounds per minute on a static rig, but only if the breech was forced open before the recoil fully ended. Regulations prohibited that. The reason was safety. If the chamber was still under pressure when the breech unlocked, the escaping gases could tear through the turret like a grenade. That was the invisible wall, the gap between mechanical potential and human procedure. To ordnance engineers, it was a necessary safeguard. To tank crews like Keane, it was dead weight. He knew that every second between shots wasn't just lost time, it was exposure. The Sherman's armor, just over 50mm thick at its front, could be punched through by a Panther or Tiger at over 1,000 meters. That meant every reload cycle was a gamble measured in seconds. In tank duels, seconds were everything. The Germans fought with precision. The Americans fought with production. But production still had to breathe. And the Sherman's breath was its firing rhythm. Inside the 3rd Armored Division, they called it the pump. You moved, you fired, you pumped the next shell. a steady pulse of survival. Keane was obsessed with that pulse. During maintenance drills, he noticed how the gun's recoil system actually lagged at the tail end of its stroke, a gentle deceleration like a piston easing into place. To him, that lag wasn't safety. It was opportunity. He measured it. 1.8 seconds of pure mechanical waiting. That was the gap he decided to erase. He didn't change the shell or the breech or the powder charge. He changed the moment of human timing, inserting action where everyone else had accepted pause. Because in the chaos of a tank duel, the first shot was survival. The second was dominance. And if he could make that second shot come faster than anyone thought possible, maybe, just maybe, he could keep his crew alive long enough to see home. No one in ordnance would have believed him. But Keane wasn't asking permission. He was about to prove it on the battlefield. Keane's shortcut wasn't philosophy. It was math. Brutal, simple, undeniable math. The Sherman's standard fire cycle was about 7.8 seconds per shot under field conditions. Multiply that across a typical 30-second engagement, and you'd get 4 rounds, maybe 5, before either side found its mark. The Germans, with their faster optics and better first-shot accuracy, almost always fired first. For a Sherman crew, survival meant rhythm. The faster you got that second shot off, the better your odds of finishing the duel still breathing. Keane broke the cycle down like a machinist breaking down a clock. He timed each component of the reload. Recoil return, 1.8 seconds. Breech open and casing ejection, 0.9 seconds. Loader insert and ram, 2.6 seconds. Breech close and lock, 0.8 seconds. Re-aim and fire, 1.7 seconds. Total, 7.8 seconds per cycle. At first glance, that seemed fixed. The loader could only move so fast. The gun only recoiled so far. But Keane saw it differently. He didn't want to make men faster. He wanted to overlap tasks. Every action in the turret happened in sequence because that's how the manual said it had to happen. But machines, unlike people, don't care about sequence. They care about thresholds, when pressure drops below X or motion returns within Y. The Sherman's recoil system didn't need to finish its stroke to be safe. It only needed the chamber pressure to fall below 500 psi, a point reached roughly halfway through the recoil arc. That happened at 0.9 seconds, but crews were trained to wait the full 1.8. Keane didn't wait. He taught himself to feel that halfway point, to listen to the tone of the returning piston through the gunner's hand grip, the faint vibration when pressure equalized. That was his cue. He could start pulling the breech open at 0.9 seconds instead of 1.8, cutting almost 1 second of dead time. The loader, seeing the breech move sooner, could ram his shell in early. Over 1 cycle, it saved 1.5 seconds. Over 10 cycles, 15 seconds. In combat, 15 seconds was the difference between life and death. When Keane tested it under live conditions, his sustained rate jumped from 7.8 seconds per shot to 4.9. That's roughly 12 rounds per minute, almost double the Army's safety-rated limit. He logged the numbers in a pocket notebook. A column for cycle time, another for temperature rise. He noticed that with the faster rhythm, barrel heat climbed 30% faster, but still within operational tolerance for short bursts. In one training test after the breakthrough, his Sherman engaged 3 target hulks in a row. The range officer recorded the time from first shot to third, 11.4 seconds. The next best crew took 22.7. When the officer demanded to see how Keane had done it, he simply smiled and said, "We skipped the wait." The ordnance team later analyzed his log and confirmed the data. Average engagement time reduced by 47%. Target acquisition efficiency increased by 36%. Ammunition expenditure per kill ratio improved by 22%. On paper, it was impossible. In the field, it was repeatable. That's what made it terrifying. Because if one crew could do it, others could too. And that meant rewriting doctrine, retraining loaders, and recalibrating safety systems. It meant admitting that the tank's rhythm wasn't mechanical. It was cultural. The Army liked predictability. Keane had just proved that predictability could kill you. His notebook closed with a single line written in grease pencil across the last page. "The gun doesn't wait. Why should I?" That was the heresy that spread through his platoon like wildfire. A whisper passed from one turret to another, until every loader started wondering what would happen if they too skipped a second. In war, seconds aren't measured in time. They're measured in survival, and Keane had just taught his crew how to steal them. It happened on a ridge outside St. Lo, late July 1944. The fields were black with soot, trees splintered into matchsticks, and the air reeked of cordite and diesel. The 3rd Armored Division had been advancing for 12 hours straight, grinding through the bocage at less than 2 miles per hour. The radio chatter was pure exhaustion. Keane's Sherman, call sign Baker 2, rolled to the edge of a hedgerow and stopped. A Panther had been spotted on the opposite slope, hull down, waiting for movement. The Americans could see the faint glint of its gun mantlet, the shimmer of heat from its exhaust. They knew if they moved first, they'd die first. Inside the turret, Keane leaned against the breech, jaw tight. His crew was young, his loader Collins barely 20, the driver just 19. Everyone was tense, silent except for the faint ticking of the turret motor. Then the call came over the radio. "Baker 2, flank left, draw him out." Keane's stomach sank. They were the bait. He whispered, "All right, boys, we're going to dance." The driver eased forward. The Panther took the bait. Its gun flashed. A shockwave tore across the ridge, missing by yards but shredding the hedgerow beside them. "Target acquired," Keane barked. "He! Up!" Collins rammed the shell in. "Up!" Keane aimed, fired. The 75mm roared. The recoil threw the turret back. The empty shell casing flew across the compartment and clattered off the floor. Smoke, chaos, adrenaline. Collins reached for the next round, but the breech hadn't fully reset. Normally, that meant wait. But Keane didn't wait anymore. He grabbed the breech lever, felt the recoil piston's vibration under his glove, the faint resonance that told him chamber pressure had dropped. He forced the lever halfway open, catching the piston before its full return, and shouted, "Now!" Collins jammed the shell in. The breech slammed shut with a solid metallic crack. "Fire!" The second shot came less than 5 seconds after the first. The Panther's gunner never expected it. The shell hit just under the mantlet, right where the armor curved. The explosion peeled the plate open like tin. Fire bloomed from inside. "Hit confirmed!" Collins yelled. Keane didn't celebrate. He was already reloading. Third shot, another 5 seconds. Fourth, 8. By the time the smoke cleared, the Panther was burning and the hedgerow was silent. Farley's command tank rumbled up beside them. He climbed out, disbelief etched on his face. "How the hell did you do that? You fired like a damn autoloader." Keane just smiled, wiping soot off his face. "Didn't let the gun catch its breath." When the platoon regrouped, they compared shell counts. Baker 2 had fired 8 rounds in less than a minute, double the average rate. Not one jam, not one misfire. It was illegal, of course. The maintenance manual warned in bold, "Never operate the breech before full recoil return." Violation meant disciplinary action or worse. But out in the fields of France, regulations meant nothing if they got you killed. Word spread fast. Tankers started whispering about Keane's half-pull, the trick that let him fire twice before a Panther's gun could cool. Some said it was madness. Others called it genius. That night, under the dim light of a blackout lamp, Collins wrote in his notebook, "We're not fighting for the manual anymore. We're fighting for time." The next morning, the battalion's mechanics inspected Baker 2. The gun barrel was scorched, the recoil system dangerously hot but intact. The ordnance officer frowned at the readings. "She's overcycled. That's against regulation." Keane replied, calm as ever, "Regulation doesn't win duels." The officer had no answer. He just closed his logbook and muttered, "Then God help us if everyone starts doing it." But they did. Because once men heard about a trick that kept you alive, no amount of ink in a manual could stop them from trying it. And by the time the next engagement came, half the platoon was skipping the weight. The Army called it unsafe. Keane called it evolution. Within weeks, what started as a single man's trick had spread like a field rumor turned gospel. They called it Keane's kick, the double stroke, or simply the shortcut. Tank crews across the 3rd Armored began to imitate it, cautiously at first, then openly during engagements. Nobody could trace where they'd heard it. Just that some guy in Baker Company had figured out how to make the Sherman's 75 bark twice before the Germans could even adjust their aim. It changed the math of survival almost overnight. The standard exchange rate, one Sherman lost for every Panther destroyed, began to tilt. Platoons that used Keane's faster rhythm reported kill ratios approaching 2-to-1, sometimes better. Engagement time per contact fell from 24 seconds to under 13. A whole company could suppress an enemy position in half the time. But speed has a price, and it always collects. The ordnance depots at Saint-Lô and Mortain began noticing strange patterns in maintenance reports. Barrel heat signatures were coming in higher than design limits. Breech blocks were showing accelerated wear. The locking lugs scuffed smooth after only a few dozen engagements. Mechanics logged it as thermal fatigue. They didn't know the real reason. Crews were cutting the recoil cycle in half. And yet, no one ordered it stopped. How could they? The field reports showed the same pattern every time. Faster reloads, fewer casualties. The cost was metal, not men. Statistically, it made brutal sense. In the chaotic 1-on-1 duels of Normandy, the side that landed the first 2 accurate shots almost always won. Keane's shortcut didn't just increase fire rate, it doubled the odds of delivering that fatal second round before the enemy corrected aim. The Army called it engagement efficiency, the men called it luck. At regimental briefings, officers started drawing charts, comparing survival curves for manual compliance versus Keane method. The difference was unmistakable. A compliant Sherman averaged 2.4 shots before destruction. A Keane mod Sherman averaged 5.1. The data didn't lie, but physics doesn't negotiate. The added stress shortened barrel life by nearly a third. Guns had to be replaced more often, and each change meant pulling a tank from the line. Logistics officers protested. But for front-line crews, that was irrelevant. The war wasn't fought in spreadsheets, it was fought in seconds. A strange duality took hold. The Ordnance Corps condemned Keane's method as reckless, while field commanders quietly encouraged it. Official memos warned, "Do not engage breech prematurely." Unofficial ones added, "Unless contact pressure requires." That phrase, contact pressure, became the loophole. Every Sherman company used it differently. Some gunners pulled early every 3rd shot, others only when under ambush. But one thing was clear. The rhythm of the Sherman line had changed. What once was steady and predictable became erratic, aggressive, alive. German units began to notice. Intercepted reports from Panzer Division complained that American tanks fire in irregular bursts, impossible to time counterfire. One officer described it perfectly. They shoot like they are angry, not afraid. And that was the transformation. The shortcut didn't just alter a machine. It altered morale. Crews who'd spent months believing their tanks were slower, weaker, and doomed suddenly felt they could outfight anything. They weren't waiting for perfection anymore, they were chasing tempo. But tempo has consequences beyond tactics. It infects strategy. The division began burning through ammunition reserves 40% faster than projected. Supply trucks struggled to keep pace. Ordnance men complained that every Sherman thinks it's artillery now. Keane watched all this with mixed emotions. He knew his trick worked. He'd seen it save lives. But he also saw barrels glowing red, recoil systems cracking, loaders with burns on their hands. The shortcut had gone viral, out of control. He wrote in his journal one night, "We made the gun faster, But we made the war faster, too. That was the paradox. The better they got at surviving, the quicker the killing multiplied. And in a war where logistics was already stretched to the breaking point, speed wasn't just power. It was entropy. The shortcut had turned into doctrine, not because headquarters approved it, but because numbers made it undeniable. But soon, numbers would also make it dangerous. By September 1944, whispers about Keane's shortcut reached the desks of people who didn't find field innovation romantic. They found it alarming. The Ordnance Corps at Saint-Lô received a cluster of identical maintenance reports from the 3rd Armored Division: cracked recoil pistons, warped breech blocks, and 2 burst cartridges that nearly cooked off inside the turret. The paperwork all came from units attached to the same regiment. The one Keane was in, so they sent investigators. 2 jeeps rolled into the company area one muddy morning. Out stepped Major Edwin H. Kramer, Ordnance Inspection Division, a man built like a slide rule. His boots were spotless, even in the muck. Behind him, 2 engineers carried clipboards and calipers. He didn't bother with greetings. "Which one of you is Staff Sergeant Keane?" Keane was sitting on the Sherman's glacis plate, wiping oil from his hands. "That'd be me, sir." "You've been modifying your firing procedure." Keane tilted his head. "I've been staying alive, sir." Kramer's jaw tightened. "You're opening the breech before full recoil return. You're aware that violates Technical Manual 9731A, Section 8? Keane didn't blink. "Sir, I'm aware it also kills Panthers faster." Kramer ordered the tank opened. The engineers crawled over Baker 2 with flashlights, muttering to themselves. They measured wear on the locking lugs, checked the recoil cylinder, examined the breech face. The gun smelled of burnt oil and carbon. When they were done, one of them handed the major a note. "Report reads, excessive heat fatigue, premature wear, cycle count inconsistent with regulation." Kramer turned back to Keane. "Do you understand what you've done? You're degrading critical ordnance property." Keane's loader, Collins, snapped. "With respect, sir, we're degrading Panthers, too." The major's eyes narrowed. "That's not the point. We designed these machines to a standard. You don't get to change it in the field." Keane stepped closer. "Then you designed them for the wrong battlefield." Silence. Kramer wasn't used to being challenged, but even he couldn't ignore the ledger from operations. Baker Company's kill ratio had doubled in 5 weeks. Their losses had dropped by half. He'd read the reports. He knew the math. He took a deep breath. "You understand, Sergeant. I can write you up for insubordination and unauthorized modification of ordnance procedure." Keane nodded. "Yes, sir." "And yet," Kramer hesitated, "every captain in this regiment wants to know how you're doing it." He looked at the tank again. Scarred, scorched, still operational. "Your shortcut may be saving lives today, but tomorrow it'll burn out the fleet. Every machine has limits." Keane folded his arms. "So do men." Kramer studied him for a long moment, then finally sighed. "You know, Sergeant, sometimes I envy field men. You don't have to think about what happens after the war." Keane's reply was simple. "I'm just trying to make sure we see it." That night, after the inspection, a memo left Saint-Lô addressed to Ordnance Command, Paris Rear Depot. It read, "Observation: multiple field crews employing premature breach operation to increase fire tempo. Method effective, but unsafe. Recommend controlled trials and standardized procedures before banning outright." It was bureaucratic language for what every man in Baker Company already knew. They weren't going to stop it. The Army couldn't outlaw success, only manage it. But something had shifted in Keane's mind that day. For the first time, he realized his shortcut wasn't just a trick. It was a fault line running through the Army itself, between those who lived by the book and those who rewrote it in grease and blood. As Kramer's jeep drove away, Collins muttered, "You think they'll actually ban it?" Keane stared after the disappearing convoy. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Once you hear that faster rhythm, you can't unlearn it." He was right, because by the time the paperwork reached headquarters, Keane's shortcut wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a doctrine in everything but name, and doctrine has a way of spreading faster than any regulation can catch it. By October 1944, the shortcut had escaped containment. It no longer belonged to Keane or Baker Company, or even the 3rd Armored Division. It had spread through the entire European theater like a contagious idea, faster than the Army could issue a bulletin to stop it. Tankers from the 2nd and 4th Armored whispered about it in mess tents, traded rumors in foxholes, scribbled diagrams on ammo crates. Some called it the half-stroke. Others called it riding the recoil. All of them called it faster. And for a while it worked. Reports from the Siegfried Line showed platoons achieving unheard-of fire tempos, suppressing bunkers before German crews could react. Units that once struggled to win frontal engagements now advanced through ambushes with almost reckless confidence. Tank commanders praised burst fire coordination, gunners delivering 2 shells within 6 seconds, stunning the enemy long enough for infantry to close in. The shortcut turned hesitation into shock. But the cost was waiting, buried in the data. At the Liège Ordnance Depot, engineers began logging catastrophic breech failures, a pattern that hadn't existed before. The breech blocks weren't exploding, but seizing shut. Microscopic fractures in the steel lugs caused by premature recoil cycling were stacking up with each engagement. One inspection report read, "Evidence suggests repeated manual override of return spring, leading to metal fatigue at 27 to 33% service life. Risk of breech seizure increases exponentially beyond 200 cycles." Translated, the faster the crews fired, the sooner the gun became a grenade waiting to happen. The first real tragedy came in early November. A Sherman from the 4th Armored, Charlie 3, was engaging an anti-tank gun near Nancy. The gunner, Corporal Hanks, had heard about Keane's kick from a replacement driver weeks earlier. He'd never trained on it, but he tried anyway, pulling the lever before the recoil finished, eager to get a second shot out. The breech jammed halfway open. The shell ignited. The explosion ripped the turret hatch off its hinges and killed 2 men instantly. The loader survived with burns that scarred him for life. After that, the shortcut became a ghost story. Some said the tank gods had punished them for cheating the manual. Others said it was bad luck, bad maintenance, bad steel. But everyone knew the truth. They'd pushed the system too far. Keane read the incident report in silence. The paper trembled in his hand. Collins, his loader, tried to ease him. "Wasn't your fault, Sarge. They didn't know what they were doing." Keane nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's the problem. Because the more the trick spread, the more its context disappeared. What Keane had done wasn't magic. It was timing, training, intuition. He could feel the right moment because he'd lived inside that turret long enough to know its heartbeat. Others were just imitating the noise." By mid-November, Ordnance Command issued a formal bulletin. "Premature breach operation is prohibited. Crews found employing unapproved modifications to firing procedure will face immediate disciplinary action." But no one enforced it. In quiet moments between battles, tankers kept experimenting, shortening recoil, adjusting hydraulic valves, even re-welding breech handles for quicker grip. The Shermans became laboratories on tracks, each crew tuning its gun like a musical instrument. It was innovation by desperation. Somewhere near the town of Aachen, Keane saw it firsthand. Another crew had built a crude spring stop using spare bolts to limit recoil travel. It worked for 3 days. Then the piston shattered. When Keane found them, the crew was alive but shaken. Their tank's interior was scorched black. The gunner looked up at him, eyes hollow. "You were right, Sarge. The trick's real. But she bites hard." Keane just nodded. "Everything worth using does." He walked away knowing the truth he'd never admit out loud. His shortcut had evolved beyond him. It was no longer a survival hack. It was a belief system. the belief that man could outthink machine, if only for a second. But belief is fragile. The battlefield doesn't care about ingenuity. It only cares about endurance. And soon, even the men who mastered Keane's rhythm would face the final test, a winter where speed meant nothing and endurance meant everything. By December 1944, the front had frozen over, not just in temperature, but in rhythm. The Ardennes was a white labyrinth of fog and ice, where tanks fought at 50 yards, and engines froze solid overnight. The shortcut, that wild burst of tempo that once defined the Sherman's new defiance, began to fade. The weather slowed everything down. Guns jammed. Oil congealed. The war itself was dragging through molasses. And yet in the few brief windows when steel met steel again, Keane's shortcut still mattered. Near Bastogne, Baker II and 3 other Shermans were ambushed by a pair of Panthers across a snow-covered field. The first shot from the Germans punched through one tank's hull and sent the crew diving for cover. Keane's tank spun to engage, breath fogging his periscope, hands slick with frost. He fired once, miss. The recoil barely finished when he pulled again, catching the piston halfway, muscle memory honed through 100 fights. Second shot, hit. The Panther's turret froze, then erupted in fire. In that moment, the shortcut was no longer about speed. It was about confidence. The men in his platoon didn't see it as a cheat anymore. They saw it as proof that they weren't just surviving by luck. They were fighting on their own terms. Tempo had given them that illusion of control in a war that stripped men of everything else. When the shooting stopped, Keane leaned against the turret and whispered, "Still works." But even he knew the truth. Every second saved was borrowed time. After the war, when ordnance analysts tallied the data, they discovered something astonishing. Sherman units that used modified loading technique, the official euphemism for Keane's method, had 24% higher survival rates in engagements under 500 meters. But their maintenance costs were 32% higher, and their gun replacement cycles nearly doubled. The shortcut worked. But it wasn't free. The math of war always demands payment. Historians would later debate whether Keane's improvisation represented ingenuity or recklessness. Some called him the father of burst doctrine, arguing that his battlefield hacks anticipated the post-war design of automatic loaders and stabilized fire systems. Others dismissed him as a lucky tinkerer, a soldier who broke rules and happened to survive long enough for someone else to take credit. But to the men who rode with him, the truth was simpler. He'd taught them that momentum was a weapon, that even inside a box of steel and fear, rhythm could save you. Not armor, not firepower, rhythm. Tempo became the hidden force of the Sherman's legacy. Later tanks, the Pershing, the Patton, even the Cold War's M48, all borrowed the principle. Reduce cycle friction, shorten delay, maximize rhythm. The engineers who built them might not have known his name, but they inherited his logic, the heresy that began with a single man pulling a lever 1 second too soon. Keane never spoke of it after the war. When a reporter asked him in 1948 if he'd ever broken regulations during combat, he just laughed. "Regulations don't bleed," he said. "Men do." The Army never officially credited him, but buried in an ordnance memo from late 1945, one line stands out. Uncontrolled field innovation resulted in temporary performance gains. Future design should account for operator impatience. Operator impatience, that was the polite phrase for what Keane represented. He'd proven that in war, innovation doesn't wait for permission. It happens in seconds, under fire, inside the human impulse to live. That was the real meaning of his shortcut. Not defiance, not genius. Survival. Mechanized. The cost of that survival was written in scorched barrels and broken manuals, but for the men who fired those guns, it was worth every page torn from the rule book. Because sometimes, the line between recklessness and revolution is just 1 second long. After the war, the factories that built Shermans went silent. The assembly lines cooled, the tools went cold, and the manuals that had once dictated every motion were packed away into archives. But somewhere in those pages, buried under the clean diagrams and official procedures, was a ghost. The ghost of a field trick that had once made a machine breathe faster. Staff Sergeant Thomas Keane went home to Pennsylvania, where he worked as a machinist again. No medals, no commendations. Just a folded photo of his crew in a mud-splattered Sherman, and a habit of tapping his thumb twice against the table before every cut, the same rhythm he'd used on the breech lever. People asked him, years later, if the stories were true. Did he really make a Sherman fire twice as fast? Did he really break the Army's rules and live to tell about it? He'd shrug and say, "We didn't have time for permission." And that was the essence of it. Keane hadn't outsmarted the Army or reinvented engineering. He'd done something far rarer. He'd reminded the system that war is not fought by manuals. It's fought by the minds inside the machines. For every innovation the Pentagon would later fund, from stabilized turrets to autoloaders and thermal sights, there was some exhausted man like Keane, crouched in a turret, hands raw, trying to shave one more second off the impossible. That's what wars really are, contests of rhythm. The side that learns faster, reloads quicker, reacts sooner, wins, not by perfection, but by tempo. In 1951, when the new M46 Patton rolled off the line, its engineers proudly advertised an improved recoil return rate and semi-automatic breech system. Nobody mentioned where that idea came from, but anyone who had fought in Normandy knew. The Army had simply built the shortcut into the design. Keane never asked for recognition. In a rare interview decades later, his voice was quiet but steady. "We didn't cheat the gun," he said. "We just stopped wasting time. Time, the one thing every soldier runs out of. That's why his story endures. Because beneath the layers of metal and doctrine, there's always that heartbeat of defiance, the belief that one man's timing can change the tempo of war. The shortcut didn't just make a Sherman faster. It made its crew believe they could rewrite the odds. And for 12 seconds in a burning field in Normandy, they did. Today, when tank crews drill and trainers talk about cycle efficiency, they're quoting data that began as one man's instinct. The same instinct that drives innovation in every age, the refusal to wait when waiting means death. Keane's legacy wasn't a broken rule, it was a principle. That speed isn't reckless if it's understood that safety means nothing without survival. In the end, his shortcut wasn't about the gun. It was about the heartbeat behind it. Because in every battle, every century, one truth never changes. Wars are won not by those who shoot first, but by those who reload faster.